And George, our next guest is with us. The honor of that introduction is in your hands.
Excellent. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Mark Mix. He's somebody I've known a long time. He has been somebody who we met each other in the sandbox. It's not that we're old. We met each other in preschool in the sandbox. Just want to make sure. No, but he is somebody who's been championing freedom and liberty for a long, long time. He's the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. He's also the president of the National Right to Work Committee. And one of my first questions to Mark will be explain why the right to work is so important, because some people might think, well, what does that mean, the right to work? Don't I have the right to work? But that's something that is near and dear to anybody who cares about liberty's heart. And he's frequently on national television programs, as Fox News or CNN or CNBC. And of course, we're glad to have him here on Conservative Commandos and the AUN TV network. You can, if you Google him, you'll be able to find his writings in all of the major publications in America. Why? Because he's fighting the good fight, and he's doing a great job of it, and has been. So with that, Mark, welcome to the Conservative Commandos. We're glad to have you here.
Well, George, it's great to be on with you, and thank you for your leadership and your strength and energy in this fight for liberty. Again, we're not that old, so I don't want to make this get too deep into this, but, George, you've been fighting as a school board member, you've been fighting as an appointee in a gubernatorial administration, you've been fighting as a candidate for ideas in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and it's a real pleasure to be talking with you and Rick about the ideas of basic liberty and basic freedom when it comes to your ability to work.
Right, exactly. So let's talk just very briefly, because I want to get into the PRO Act, but let's just preface this idea of what does it mean, right to work? Because some people might say, well, of course I have the right to work. And the answer is actually, you might be surprised. And it's a good thing that Mark Mix is fighting this fight, because he wants to make sure you do have that right, but don't take it for granted.
Yeah, that's right, George. I mean, the right to work issue is very, very simple, and it's a good thing for me that it's very simple. And it really basically boils down to this. Look, if you want to join a labor union in America, join. If you want to associate with a labor union in America, associate. If you want to give your paycheck to a labor union, your entire paycheck to a union, do it. But if you don't want to be compelled as a condition of your employment, of getting a job, of putting food on the table for your family, to join a private organization that advocates ideas and principles that you disagree with, then you'll support right to work. The right to work laws that are in effect in 27 states today across the country are literally that simple. If you want to join, do it, but you can't be forced. In 23 states across this country, George, even in a grand experiment of self-government where we have freedom of association that presupposes the opportunity not to associate, you can't have one without the other, we allow governments and we allow union officials to have workers fired for simply failing to tender dues or fees to a labor union. That's wrong. It's an injustice. It's been an injustice since the 1930s when the federal government grabbed labor relations and brought them back to Washington, D.C. And like so many things that come back here, George and Rick, it usually doesn't end well for individual freedom and individuals. But right to work literally is that simple. Just your ability to choose whether or not you want to financially support a labor union.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, you think about it, you're right. That freedom to associate implies the freedom to choose not to associate. And yet some people will tell you that if you have a job but then don't join the union, they're going to fire you. And imagine that. Like, can you imagine, like, if they said, in order to keep your job, you're going to have to go to my church? If the boss said that to you, you'd be like, wait a minute, I think I have freedom of religion, don't I? No. It's like people wouldn't tolerate that. But yet somehow we do with this. So I appreciate the work you do because you don't get a lot more fundamental in terms of freedom than the ability to support yourself and your family. And then someone says, but if you'd like to do that, you're going to have to join the club we tell you to join. And you have to give them money to spend the way they want to spend it. Be like, wait a minute. Yeah. It's crazy.
That's right, George. You've spent time out on the campaign trail. You've spent time as a school board member. You were even you were on the Workplace Advocacy Council in Virginia. How many people approached you during your various roles and services said, look, George, I really want to be forced to join a union and pay dues to keep a job here in the Commonwealth of Virginia or anywhere in the country? Anybody?
No, that never happened. No one ever came to me and said, my life is awesome, except I need to be compelled to join a union. Because you can if you want. Nobody stops you. But anyhow, let's talk a little about the PRO Act, because the PRO Act like so many things in Washington, they name things with either names that are falsely descriptive, that if it was a can of soup, you'd be able to sue them for damages for lying to you. Or they just give it some amorphous name that is not very descriptive at all. So that, they call it soup, but when you open it up, you find out it's actually more like fishing bait. And you're like, wait a minute. I thought I was getting a can of soup here, and what I got is a bunch of worms. And it seems to me, the PRO Act is kind of innocuous. There's nothing in it that says this is horrible. But it is, because it's nationalizing all the policies that are destroying California right now. Well, not all of the policies, but a number of them.
Yeah, absolutely. The PRO Act stands for Protecting the Right to Organize. That's the short title of this bill. And nothing in the bill will do anything about protecting the right to organize, because those rights are already protected. They're protected under federal statute going back to the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s. They're protected by statute in many state legislatures across the country. I mean, the idea of your right to organize is something that is defended not only by the liberals and the left and the union bosses, but it's even defended by the National Right to Work Foundation. We've represented employees that have tried to organize unions and have been punished for that. And the right to work law says that you have the choice either way. And so the right to work law protects your right to organize, but it also protects your right not to be associated. So this protecting right to organize is totally one of those titles that you talk about, George. It's like the Clean Air Act that required, or the Clean Water Act that required us to actually put pollutants into the water to meet the federal standards. Or it's like the so-called Employee Free Choice Act that back a couple years ago would have eliminated a worker's right to vote by secret ballot whether or not they wanted to be in a union. So you give employees free choice by taking away their right to vote in a secret ballot election. The titles mean nothing. But this bill is literally a smorgasbord of everything that union officials have wanted for the last 60, 70, 80 years and have been unable to get through the legislative process at various times during, the last 80 years. But here's what's in it, first and foremost, is repeal of all 27 right-to-work laws across the country. It basically says all right-to-work laws are void, no states can pass anymore, and in those states where you had that protection, you could now be forced to pay dues or fees to keep your job. It also has what you mentioned, George, some of the stuff coming out of California as it relates to gig employees and freelance employees, making them employees instead of independent contractors. It radically changed the business environment in California to the point where the liberal left jumped on it and said, we've got to reform this because these journalists and editors and writers for a lot of different platforms were being designated as employees, and the employer didn't want them full time. They appreciated the fact that they would make contributions over the course of a year, but the test turned out to be something like, if you wrote so many articles, you became an employee, and it put literally hundreds of thousands of people out of work in California. Well, the language on that AB 5 is now in the PRO Act that passed, interestingly enough, George, the House of Representatives back 2 weeks ago with a 225 to 206 vote. This House Bill 842 passed the House of Representatives, is now on its way to the Senate. And the bill repeals right-to-work laws. It implements this AB 5 restrictions on freelance and gig employees, think Uber and Lyft. It allows secondary boycotts, which is something that, what the heck is that, Mark? Well, George, let's say you and Rick run a bakery shop, and the union decides to unionize your employees, and you push back a little bit, saying, you know what, I don't want it. I think our employees are good just the way they are. What the union can do under the secondary boycott privilege is they can go to your flour vendor, your delivery, the person that sends you the flour daily, and stop them and shut them down to put pressure on you. That's been illegal.
Mark, isn't that racketeering?
Well, not under union policy.
If the mafia did that, and the mafia, I watch TV. I guess that's what the mafia did that. They go to your competitors. They go to contractors and say, you don't join a union, you don't cooperate, you're out of business. George, that's right. I'm sorry to jump in, George. Isn't that, you're an attorney? Isn't that racketeering?
Well, it's pretty outrageous, but obviously if the law permits it, then they've taken that out of what would normally be the case. Like so much in Washington, to be honest, if you or I do something or Mark does something, they're very happy to criminalize it. But if it's their allies that are doing the exact same thing, they'll find a way to make it okay.
Yeah, and George, just to give you two examples of that, the Sherman Antitrust Act exempts unions from antitrust violations. Okay, that's one. Secondly, it's a Supreme Court decision in 1973 called Ennoms, E-N-N-O-M-S, said that union officials could not be prosecuted for acts of violence used to obtain a legitimate union objective. So if the two of us got together, you and I, George, got together and we strong-armed Rick for some of his property, that would be extortion, that would be racketeering. But if the unions do it to get a union vote or to get a pay raise or whatever it is, their legitimate union objective, they are exempt from prosecution under the Hobbs Racketeering Act. So you can't make this stuff up. It's just the way it is.
Well, that explains. I used to work for a gentleman years ago who ran a bread company, and one evening at 2 a.m, a bread delivery truck was driven through the front of his house.
Oh.
And it was while they were negotiating a contract. They were attempting to send a message. So I guess if I did that, to obtain a better result in a contract negotiation, I could go to jail for that. But I guess the union's like, no harm, no foul. Wow.
That's pretty much the way it's determined, the way it comes down in cases. I mean, the unions always use this defense when they're charged with some kind of violent act. They say, well, you can't prosecute us because we were trying to obtain a legitimate union objective. And they got the Supreme Court to agree with that somehow, some way. But those are some of the special privileges. In this bill, the PRO Act, just to expand on that, this is all about giving union officials more privileges over workers. It literally has nothing to do with workers that they claim to represent. It's this new whole kind of smorgasbord, if you will, of new powers for union officials to entice, and I'm using my finger quotes here, entice more workers into the union.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's what it's all about. It's about power, and and I would argue that unions would be more effective if they had to earn your allegiance. Like, if McDonald's treats you shabbily, you can go to Burger King or you can do whatever. But if the only guy in town that's allowed to sell you a burger is one company and they give you cold fries and a warm milkshake, what's his incentive to do better next time? And so I would argue one of the reasons why I don't feel like unions serve the needs of their members very well is because they don't have any incentive to be honest with you. It's just...
Yeah. That's exactly right. And George, interestingly enough, you agree completely with Samuel Gompers, who is known as the father of the American labor movement. In 1924, in his final speech to the AFL convention, to the delegates of that convention in El Paso, Texas, he once again implored the delegates not to go to government for special powers to force workers to join him. He said, the workers of America adhere to voluntary institutions. Anything else is a menace to their rights. And that which is invincible through voluntarism will be destroyed by compulsion. And he's exactly right. And that's the point that you make, that, look, if you're, everyone knows that an organization brought together through voluntary means, that you join because you want to be a member or because you want to support the organization, is inherently stronger than one that is cobbled together through force and compulsion. Union officials have to play politics because they're wards of government now. Their power is a derivative of government action. And that's what this PRO Act is about, to give them more government power, to force more workers to elect more politicians who will give them more power. And it's this vicious cycle that has existed in America since federal government took over labor policy.
Absolutely. Well, we are up against the break, Mark, so I know that Rick's going to want to jump in. He's got more stuff to talk about, and I don't want to monopolize your time. But to our viewers and listeners, this is the Conservative Commandos. I'm George Landrith. He's Rick Trader, and our guest is Mark Mix. And we will be right back. But if you've missed any portion of the show, you came in late, or you want to share it with a friend and say, hey, you got to hear this, go to our website, ccrshow.com. You can get a rebroadcast there. In the meantime, we will be back.
Mark Mix is our guest. He's the president of the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and he's also the president of the National Right to Work Committee. And we're discussing the PRO Act, AB 5. And Mark, thank you for holding through that break. We appreciate your time. Mark, this PRO Act, this AB 5, so bad. The voters of California of all places, said, we don't like this. In fact, they went out to vote November 2020 and said no to AB 5. If it's that bad that California don't want it, what is good in this for the rest of America?
Well, Rick, there's nothing good in this bill. And again, it's about union officials getting more power over more workers to compel more workers to pay them dues. It literally is a smorgasbord of everything that union officials have wanted. I think to your point, and that's a good lead into this segment to talk about, if California rejects it, why shouldn't the rest of America? And I agree with you. The rest of America should reject it. But it's about power and it's about politics. And when you mix those two together, especially now in Washington, D.C., with the current administration who not only endorses the PRO Act, but says he is the strongest union president in the history of the country. I mean, he's going to promote unionism. I say it 3 times because he said it 3 times. I don't know if he forgot himself that he had said it the first time, but he said it 3 times. And we believe him. We're taking him, at his word. The first thing he did, which is interesting because while union officials from big unions endorse Joe Biden's presidency, what he's done to rank and file workers is a pretty good indication of kind of the way he feels about the difference between workers and union officials. Take the Keystone Pipeline situation. Literally within minutes of him taking the Oval Office and taking power and having a pen in his hand, he signed an executive order that literally put thousands of union members on the unemployment line, even though his union bosses back here in Washington, D.C. spent those workers' money to endorse him to office. This is the type of thing in the disconnect that we have with rank-and-file workers and union officials, and then now add in Joe Biden and a Congress, Nancy Pelosi, that passes the PRO Act with these really, really egregious things that even California can't stomach, and you've got a mix for some really significant action, and really, thanks to you and George for allowing people to hear this message and pay attention to what's happening on these big issues that deal with America's workplace.
Mark, you said this passed the House. What's the prospects in the Senate?
Well, the prospects, if they had to use the regular Senate rules, the rules of debate and the extended debate that allows a minority to be heard on an issue and fully expose kind of the impact of that issue, if they have a filibuster, it's going to be hard for Richard Trumka, the AFL-CIO, and Barack Obama and President Kamala Harris to find the votes they need to get it to the White House for signature. But if they take away the filibuster, then it's a simple majority vote. And it may be that the Democrat Party has shifted so far to the left that there's nobody left that would defend, for example, Mark Warner here in Virginia. Will he defend Virginia's right to work law? Will he defend Virginia's workers against secondary boycotts and AB 5 type of definitions of employees versus independent contractors? We don't know. Will Kristen Sinema from Arizona, will Joe Manchin from West Virginia, will John Tester from Montana, will those senators stand up once they realize the impact of what they're going to do if they change the Senate rules? Will they fight back, push back? Will Mitt Romney go the other way? Will Susan Collins, will Senator Murkowski from Alaska do something? It's really up in the air, and that's why people have to pay attention to what's going on in Washington, because it's not just the PRO Act. There are a whole host of other bills out there that basically will be defended by the extended debate rules of the Senate and the filibuster. If they take that away, it's Katie bar the door as to what happens not only on the labor policy front, but on every front that we can imagine here. And George may speak to that.
Mm. Mark, correct me if I'm wrong. Over the past few decades, union membership has declined everywhere except for government workers. That union has increased in size. Am I right or wrong about that? Am I right or wrong in thinking that people are rejecting unions and want the option to not pay union dues? My wife was a teacher. She was forced to join a teachers union, or she was in a teachers union. A couple of her colleagues decided not to, but they still had to pay the union dues.
Yeah, the union, as far as union numbers, it's decreased a little bit, but we go back to the mid-1950s and you had about a 36% union density in the private sector workforce. Today it's down to about 6.2%. That doesn't mean there's a lot less union members. It means the American economy has grown and employers have been, concerned about the relationship between their employees. And to your point, more specifically, Rick, yes, workers are rejecting unions in union elections. I mean, unions basically say they have a winning record when there's an election, but they always pull out before the election day when they know they're going to lose, so it makes their numbers look a lot better. But look, nothing stops workers from joining unions, and this PRO Act will simply give union officials more power to force more workers in. But Rick, look, you know about this, the way this works. You have a history in aviation, I understand, and you know the 1 in 60 rule that
How'd you know that?
Yeah, if you fly 1 degree off course for a mile, for every mile you fly, you're 92 feet off the target. So after an hour, a bomber is going to hit something that's 9 miles away. It may be a house or something they weren't intended to hit. American labor policy has been at least 1 degree off for the last 80 years. And so we're way out here on the side of compulsion. We're way out here on the side of force. And, you know, when we navigate for liberty and we navigate for freedom, that's a pretty defined destination. When we understand what that means, when individuals are given the choices to make decisions for themselves and their families. That's a pretty good target, and one that is a beacon that should radiate and keep us right on course for who we are as Americans. But now we fly off course, government gets right more power, and we are so far from the target of individual freedom and liberty in labor policy that it's going to take a while to get back, that's for sure.
Mark Mix, in a minute or two that we have left, tell us what you all do at the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation and also the National Right to Work Committee. What do you guys do during the day?
Yeah, the Legal Defense Foundation has been around since 1968, and all we do is defend employees. In any given 12-month period, we have anywhere from 250 to 260 open cases defending workers to exercise their rights in American workplaces if their rights have been violated by forced unionism. We've been to the Supreme Court 18 times on behalf of individual workers defending their rights there. We literally have cases in every venue you can imagine, from the National Labor Relations Board through that adjudication process, through state court, through federal courts, courts of appeals. We have 21 lawyers on staff that do nothing but provide free legal representation to workers. The committee's been around since 1955. Our goal is to make sure we protect what we have. That would be the 27 right-to-work laws that currently exist, pass more right-to-work laws, which we hope to do in the very near future, and basically stand up for individual workers in the state legislatures across the country and here in Washington, D.C. We participate and monitor and get involved in legislation all across the country. We use our 2.8 million member base to lobby politicians. And you know, it's not, Rick, it's not calling up the politicians and say, do this or do that. It's when they get calls from 300, 400, 1,000, 5,000 constituents say, don't do it or vote for this. That's when you really have impact in the public policy world. And that's what the committee's been doing since 1955.
Well, Mark Mix, we want to thank you so much for joining us here in the Conservative Commandos radio show. Mark, tell our audience how they can find out more about what you do and also more about the National Right to Work Committee, and maybe they need your help. How would they contact you?
Absolutely, Rick. Well, they can find us on that amazing internet at www.nrtw.org. That would be the foundation.
Thank that Al Gore for inventing it, right?
That's right. Al Gore's amazing internet. That's correct. So nrtw.org for the foundation, and you can get all your questions answered about what your rights are in the states that you live in, what your rights are vis-a-vis unionization. You can talk to a lawyer for free if you call in. We have a toll-free number, 1-800-336-3600. On the committee side, you can go to our little map and find out what bills are pending in your state that have an impact on the workplace. You can find out the bills that are pending in Congress, who the sponsors are, who the co-sponsors are, who's voting right, who's voting wrong. You can find that information at the National Right to Work Committee at nrtwc.org, nrtwc.org for the committee.
Mark Mix, thank you so much for joining us. I bet this is a very interesting time for you, my friend.
Indeed it is. Yeah.
And thank you so much for joining us. Take care and God bless. And you are listening to and watching the Conservative Commandos radio show with George Landrith and yours truly, Rick Trader.